So one of the skills that I have picked up over the last several years is that I've become really good at clearing a room. Like not every room, well, most rooms, don't get up and leave like right now, but I've become really good at clearing the rooms in my house. And it's not that I don't believe that my wife and my 2 daughters don't love me, but there are times where it is clear they do not want to be around me. And there are certain things that I can do that clear the room. And so I've mentioned before that in our home, we do not have a television in the living room. And that's deliberate, it's on purpose, because it forces us to spend time together, talking, sharing, and doing life, just visiting. And what happens is that when we're together, sort of sitting around the house, I get to serve as DJ for the whole house. And I serve as DJ because I paid for the speakers. And so we'll be sitting around and talking, and suddenly my mood will change and I want to play a song. And they all start to leave the room when they hear me play this song. Does anybody know what this song is? What is it? Anybody? Just Breathe. Pearl Jam, Just Breathe. Here's why they leave when I play this song. Because it's about death. And it's about someone dying. And a couple of years ago, I was watching this movie, Kodachrome, and it's about this father and a son, and the son takes his father, who is a famous photographer, on a road trip to get some film developed before the father dies. And it's the last Kodachrome processing laboratory in the United States, and they're making this long trip, and they're just driving this convertible, and suddenly we know dad's dying, and they've been estranged for years, and this song plays, and I find myself watching this not really great movie and like weeping. Because I have this little tick in me where no matter what it is, no matter what's happening in my life, I make a playlist. I have a playlist for everything. There is a distinct playlist for every book that I've written. I have one playlist. This is the book writing playlist. Whenever I'm writing, I have that same playlist play over and over and over again. I have a distinct playlist for when I write sermons. That's the same playlist every single time. I have a pre-preaching playlist. It's 2 hours long, and it is all lyrical content that I would never use when actually preaching. My friend Matt Broadus, who worships our worship pastor at our Westside campus, we both have daughters this year who are seniors in high school, and so they're off to college next fall. And so I made us a playlist. It's just called Senior Year Feels. And it's songs like Never Grow Up by Taylor Swift, Forever Young, Rod Stewart's Forever Young, Daughters by John Mayer. Those are other songs that when I play them, the girls often leave the room as well. And so, recently I was sitting in the living room, we were talking, and I start playing that song, Just Breathe. And Catherine rolls her eyes, which is normal. And she goes, "Dad, why can't you just be normal?" And she's right. Like when it comes to death, I am not normal. My entire life, I have been fascinated with death. I think about death and dying way too much. Like the number of people who deeply care and love about me who have looked at me and said, like, "Do you think you need to see somebody?" because I'm always talking about death and dying, but I blame the church that I grew up in as a kid because they were always telling us about people dying. Like somebody was on their way to get baptized, they were unsaved, and on their way there, they got in a car wreck or had a heart attack and they died and they were estranged from the Lord. Make sure that you're right with God before you die. And I really believe that their entire intent when I was a kid was to scare kids to death. And I never understood why my parents wouldn't let me see horror movies, but every week they would allow me to listen to the scariest preacher on the planet. And here's the truth. Like, I hate that people die. I resent it. And even more than that, what we all go through if we live to an old age before we die, well, that's just horrible. People losing their fitness, their bodies wasting away. And what kind of reward is that for a life of serving and loving and caring about other people? This last Christmas, we got together with my wife's side of the family. My mother-in-law is the oldest of 4. And Rochelle has shared, and I've shared with some of you before, that she's in this slow slide of dementia. And now all 4 of those siblings have been diagnosed with some form of dementia. And we get together at Christmas, and for the first 20 minutes, all of them and their spouses, the conversation is pretty much about remedies for body aches and arthritis and shingles and which hearing aid works best. Like, this is what you get? But for the last couple of years, I've thought about death and dying a lot more. I mean, mostly because my brother died, and that sort of fast forwards you thinking about the reality of those kinds of things. But all the talk of death and all my thinking about dying has just been front of mind for me. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure that my next book is going to be about death and dying. I'm just working on the playlist right now. And I've discovered a British priest who wrote in the 1600s. His name is Jeremy Taylor, and he wrote this book, Holy Living, Holy Dying. And this is what he says. He says, as a man grows old, his sleep grows still more broken and disturbed. He wakes often, usually to pee, and sleeps not again. He tosses and tumbles and finds no rest for his limbs till the morning comes and finds him unrefreshed. God hath given man a short time here upon earth, and yet upon this short time, eternity depends. And what Taylor is saying is that life is pretty dynamic, but in the grand scheme, it's relatively short. But in this time, this very short time, what is crucial is that you learn how to live. And so if you've been around Ecclesia for the last month or so, that you know that we've been walking through some of these crucial stories in the book of Genesis. And Genesis is asking and answering questions like, who is God and who are humans, and what are humans in light of who God is, and what are we here for, and how did we get here? All of those are really important questions. But most of the time, when people open the book of Genesis, because it is actually named Genesis, we are asking questions about the beginning of things. How did we get here? How did God create the world? How did God create humans? And one of the questions we ask less often is about the end of things. And not the end of things in a cosmic sense, but the end of things for us on this side of the veil, like what happens when we die. And questions like, what do you want your death to accomplish? I don't know a lot of people who have asked that question. What do you want your death to accomplish? Have you considered that your death can actually do something in the world? And there's this little text in Genesis 25 that we almost always overlook. And it's about this very thing. And this is what Genesis 25 says, starting in verse 1. It says, in time, Abraham married another woman named Keturah. Keturah gave birth to additional children: Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan fathered Seba and Dedan. Dedan's sons were Asherim, Letshim, and Limum. Midian's sons were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abida, and Eldah. All these were Keturah's children and grandchildren. In the end, though, Abraham gave everything he owned to Isaac. To the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts while he was still alive. But then he sent them away to the east, far away from what would now be his son Isaac's household. Abraham lived a total of 175 years. By the time Abraham took his last breath and joined his ancestors in death, he had reached a ripe old age and had lived a full life. His sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, the son of Zophar the Hittite, to the east of Mamre. Hidden behind all of those names that you skipped over when you read it on your own are some keys to how to die well that Genesis tells us at the end, that Abraham died well. And I think there are clues all throughout Genesis about how we do that. And one of the ways that we die well is that we learn to own our wrongs. You remember the story of Abraham? God comes to him in Genesis 12. He says, I'm going to make a covenant with you. Your children are going to be more than the sand on the seaside and the stars in the sky. And Abraham doesn't really believe all of that, and it takes a whole lot of time, and he and his wife are old already. So his wife Sarah comes and says, go have a child with Hagar. And so they do, and that's good for a while, but then Sarah actually does get pregnant, and then she has Isaac, and so she has Abraham send Ishmael and Hagar away. And God finds Hagar in the desert and tells her that he's going to bless her life. Then you have that story we talked about a couple of weeks ago, when God comes to Abraham and says, I want you to sacrifice your son Isaac. And Isaac's bound, and right at the end, there's a ram in the thicket. And then Isaac grows up a little bit more and meets Rebekah. And then we have this story where everybody's dead. Abraham goes and finds a new wife because Sarah has died. And Isaac now has his own wife, and it ends with the death of Abraham. And this seems like it might be a standard old everyone dies story. but it's not. So one of my favorite writers, Jonathan Sacks, talks about it. He says this. He says, in chapter after chapter, we read of the love and faithfulness Abraham and Sarah had for one another. Together, they embarked on a long journey to an unknown destination. Together, they stood against the idolatry of their time. Twice, Sarah saved Abraham's life by pretending to be his sister. They hoped and prayed for a child and endured the long years of childlessness until Isaac was born. Then Sarah's life draws to a close. She dies. Abraham mourns and weeps for her and buys a cave in which she is buried, and he is to be buried beside her. We then expect to read that Abraham lived out the rest of his years alone before being placed beside Sarah, his wife, in a cave at Machpelah. Unexpectedly, however, once Isaac is married, Abraham marries a woman named Keturah and has 6 children by her. We are told nothing else about this woman, and the significance of the episode is unclear. The Torah does not include incidental details. So at the beginning of chapter 25, we meet this woman, Keturah. And where'd she come from? And who is she? And so I read a lot of novels and I watch a lot of movies, and oftentimes when I'm sitting with someone talking about a movie or we're in the middle of a movie, I will tell them, well, you know who did it, don't you? And they will say, no, who? I was like, that guy. And they say, how do you know that? Because there's no other reason for them to be in this movie. The details aren't incidental. And there's an ancient midrash that when Isaac goes on his journey, where he ends up finding Rebekah, or actually Rebekah finds him, the purpose of that journey is that Isaac has been sent to find Hagar. And in the ancient world, and all through the Bible, people have multiple names. And this is Abraham owning his wrongs. That this woman has borne him a son. And he sent her away to appease his wife. And he is making right what went wrong. Sometimes we are so convinced of our righteousness, and in our culture, people will do almost anything before they own their wrongs. And what do you want to be said about you when your last day has come, when it's all over, about the way you handled your mistakes, the way you handled your sins? Because I'm going to read you in on a little secret. It's not that we are not perfect people. Oftentimes, we're not even very good people. And we harm people and hurt people all the time. Whether we mean to or not, or it's intentional or not, one of the truths for those of you who are parents that you know deeply, like you have messed up your kids. You have harmed your kids. You have said something in a moment of frustration or anger or stress, and it might have just washed over you and you've never thought about it before, but it rooted down in them. And the same thing happens to our partners and at work with our bosses and subordinates. Like, you have been wrong. What will you do to fix it while you have time to fix it? And when you're owning your wrongs, you also need to own your responsibilities. Now, there's a promise made to Abraham that he's going to have a lot of children, and he does. And let me tell you about children. They are expensive. And here's the thing. And a lot of young people don't understand this. Like when they're getting married, they want to say, oh, I want to start a family. Like you have these children and they don't leave. Like you can't take them back. You can't trade them in. It's not like a car, like you have it, drive it for 5 or 7 years and you trade, like they are here. And for all of his children, from Ishmael on down, before Abraham dies, he gives them gifts. One of the great privileges of love is responsibility. And you cannot have one without the other. And so the people that you love, what are the gifts that you choose to give them? What do you want to pass on for them to know? You have to own those responsibilities. And I talked to my friend John several years ago, and at that time, his youngest child was 28 years old. And Rochelle and I asked him, it's like, in your parenting journey, what was the hardest time to be a parent? And he said, right now. That the people that God has blessed us with are our responsibility. And they are ours to give something to. What is it of you that you want to give to them? And then to be a reason for reconciliation. And the beautiful part of this story is that Isaac and Ishmael, these two brothers who would become two peoples, they come together in the end to bury their father together. And so much has happened. Part of it is just kind of just being brothers between the two of them, and part of it is tension and distance caused by their mothers. Events that they had no control over. But in the end, they come together over something more important than either. So here's the easiest thing to do living in 2025. The easiest thing to do in 2025 is to join the division. Whether it's economic, educational, political, to say that this is my team. And I don't care that my team has distinctly different virtues than my team has ever had before. That's my team and I'm sticking with it. I don't care about what's right or what's good or what's beautiful. I'm just with my team. And so I'll defend my team, anchor myself to them. I will argue and create enemies with people who aren't like me. But that's a terrible way to die. Do you really want to leave the world worse off than you found it? For relationships that you touch to be worse than you found them? My guess is that most people aren't like me and have written out what their eulogy should sound like. But what do you want it to say? What do you want people to hear when your time is done? One of the fascinating pieces of this little section of Genesis 25 is that it's called the Chayah Shirai, which is the life of Sarah. And the reason that's weird is because Sarah is not in it at all. It's the life of Sarah, and she's dead when it starts. And Ecclesia, here's what I want you to know. No matter how successful you think you've been, how much or how little money you have earned, regardless of your heartaches and traumas and joys, that your life will leave ripples, that it will affect people. People that you know and who are close, and people you will never know existed. And when they write the end of your story, what do you want it to say? Let me pray for you. God, give us a vision for the end of our story, so we can begin to live into that end today, to make it true and beautiful and healing. And so we ask for courage in the places that are unredeemed and unreconciled in our lives, that you would come with your Spirit to give us help and aid. And we ask it in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.